Welcome and good afternoon. I'm now going to call the Citizens Advisory Committee meeting to order. As permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of January 8th, 2021, the determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee. To ensure that the meeting is as transparent as possible, we will post the meeting materials approximately 1 week in advance, provide a recording of this meeting linked on our website, and we will take all votes by roll call. And so now we'll move on to item 2, in which we will combine the approval of the December 8th meeting minutes along with the roll call. Do I have a motion to approve the December 8th meeting?
So moved, Lulu.
Thank you. Do I have a second?
I'll second. This is Kevin.
Thank you, Kevin. Great. Okay, so now we'll move on to the attendance and the approval of the minutes. Please unmute yourself. Was there a question? Okay, maybe background noise. Please unmute yourself and say yay or nay on the approval of the December 8th meeting minutes. So I'll start off with Elliot Hartstein.
Aye.
Thank you. Lulu Blacksmith.
Yay.
Great. Thomas Gary. Blake Grisby. Daniel Hogman. Kevin Ivers.
Yay.
Thank you. Renee Patton. Stephanie Pressler. Ruth Rosas.
Yay.
Thank you. Faye Sinha. Okay. Zara Suratwala.
Yay.
Thank you. All right. We'll move on then to, I believe we have a quorum here. We'll move on to our announcements. And so we do have a few announcements to share with the committee before we move on to today's presentations. So I'm now going to invite our Executive Director, Erin Alleman, to share a few key messages from the board meeting.
Thanks. And actually, these messages are a little bit old, but I think still relevant. We have our board meeting. It's like, what's today? Tuesday? Board meetings tomorrow, and the MPO Policy Committee meets quarterly. They meet on Thursday. And at this month's board meeting and then MPO Policy Committee meeting, they'll be focused on approving our budget for FY22, which will start on July 1st. So that's the primary focus of our board and MPO Policy Committee meetings this month, but we also have been talking with them about a number of the initiatives that we have underway here, which include the mobility recovery planning that we've been doing. So we've convened a series of stakeholders from across the region that extends beyond transportation stakeholders. So transportation stakeholders, but we're also bringing together, people who've been focused on equity, some university partners and others to talk about what happens should transit not recover, and should that have sort of this reverberating effect on the transportation system overall across our region. So we really want to focus on how do we make sure that our transportation systems are financially sustainable. And I know Stephanie Levine is on the call today and probably going to be talking with you a little bit about this project. So I'll save the good stuff for her, but it's important work, and we're excited to have folks at the table. And I think that there's some, obviously a role for this committee to provide input into the work as well. I'll also note too that, a few months ago, we heard back from the Census Office, the US Census Bureau. They put out some population estimates by state. No surprise to us, unfortunately, that our population rate continues to decline overall as a state. There were a few bright spots in the region. The collar counties did see some small growth or no growth, which was better than loss. But again, I think this continues to put us in a position where we want to be proactive about staving off continued losses. And we believe that the best way for us to do that is to really focus on economic recovery and making sure that our region is putting in place sort of the collaborative policies, that we're thinking about not only just development, but we're thinking not about competing amongst ourselves, but really making sure that we are an outstanding place to live, work, and play when we compare ourselves to peers across the country. So when the Census Bureau releases its official tally for the 2020 census, we'll do further analysis, but this is sort of just an annual data point that they put out every year. So it's not the official census numbers just yet.
Are we expecting those numbers in September?
I mean, I think that that would be the hope right now. But again, they seem to be delayed. I think the biggest question we've been getting to is, are we going to lose one congressional seat or two? The hope really is zero, but possibly one, worst case scenario two. So, and I know that redistricting also has a big impact too. I think people want to figure out what that's going to look like, but I could foresee this being installed even more depending on how the data reliability looks like on the other end. We just don't have a sort of clear view into what that is right now.
We know what the significance is of them eliminating some of the metro areas in terms of Illinois, in terms of cutting down on which are going to be considered
metropolitan and micropolitan areas. Yeah, we've been watching that pretty closely. It doesn't actually impact our region, but it would impact some regions that have multiple metropolitan areas within them. So the Milwaukee area is made up of 3 different metropolitan regions, one of which is pretty small, I think would meet that. So what the Census Bureau and the OMB are proposing to do, I'm not sure if it's exactly OMB, so to change the designation for metropolitan areas and shift that from 50,000 people and above to 100,000. That rule's been in place for about 50 years. So from the census, the folks that we've talked to from DC, from the data folks' perspective, it's time to update, right? We've got people living in urban areas. We need to redefine sort of what that threshold is. And from their perspective, they don't make the decisions on how to use the data. They just sort of set the rules and, things shouldn't change. On the other side of the equation, our associations, counties, regional government associations, and metropolitan planning organizations have been arguing, there are many of them that do fall between that 50 and 100,000 population threshold. And so what does it mean for them? And are they now not eligible for the same number of grants, transportation resources, et cetera? So, it's not exactly pertinent to us specifically, but more so to smaller places. So we'll see. I think that, my guess is it looks like it's on track to be published, but I know that a number of smaller MPOs are making comments about the thresholds concerns that they have. Let's see. Legislative agendas. We also, at the last board meeting, approved our state and federal legislative agendas. They haven't changed much over the years. They're really focused on implementing the 2050 plan on the state side. We've been focused on making sure that there's dedicated funds for comprehensive planning, that we're focused on equitable performance-based capital programming initiatives as well, and that we're making sure that, as data becomes available for transportation through new mobility, that data remains open and transparent. So all things you've heard us talk about previously, but all things that we continue to push for at the state and the federal levels as well.
I noticed that there is a bill that pretty much focuses on our performance-based approach, which was introduced by Senator Bill. And that's, I thought that was a really positive thing to see it reflect those basic principles that CMAP has long advanced. I mean, obviously, I don't know where the bill's going to go, but I certainly have talked it up to a lot of people, and I know a lot of people were, at least appear to be initially receptive to it. I think that bill is important, in terms of it's more important than a lot of people realize. A lot of people don't understand the significance, and I think it's an important one. It's good to see.
Yeah, we appreciate you talking to folks about the importance of that too, right? It's something that our plan talks about. From our perspective, it's one of the areas that we really want to partner with the state DOT to help support them in their initiatives. So we've been trying to engage them around, how we can use some of the tools and the data resources that we have here and apply them statewide, should this become a reality. But even if it doesn't, you don't necessarily need legislation to implement some of these things. So we've been trying to tackle this from multiple sides. I mentioned the budget and work plans up for approval at tomorrow's board and policy committee meeting. And we talked a little bit about, and many of you heard me talk with Lulu about the International Women's Day panel that we held yesterday. Just note that nationally, the labor participation of women is at the lowest point since 1988. And so I think, you know, again, you don't want to let a good, I guess, pandemic go to waste, right? And not think about some of the things that need to change. But focusing on some of the policies that help create a level playing field for women, Black and Latinas as well, is something that we talked about yesterday on that panel. And I know that many of our stakeholders across the region are thinking about. So finally, I think I mentioned this last time when I talked to y'all, but we are officially moved over to the old post office. Michelle and I were there on Monday to make sure that we had a strong internet connection, and Stephanie's been in. So we've had a few staff in and out just from time to time to focus on making sure that we're able to perform our duties and make sure our committee meetings go well as necessary, because often, you know, home internet is not as reliable as downtown internet. But we aren't anticipating folks fully returning to the office for some time still. So we want to be flexible and support staff in getting their work done, but it'll probably be working from home through most of the summer. But once people start getting vaccinated, we'll have to talk and see what other government entities are doing in terms of letting other people into their office spaces as well. So it's one thing to think about your own staff, but then to think about the number of committees and partners that we have and the space that we want to have people in. So we'll continue to keep you informed as we develop policies and procedures for that. But right now, you know,
What's the status on vaccinations for staff? Do you have, or you know?
You know, we don't know, and we probably cannot ask at this point in time, just because it's, you know, medical information. And I would say probably a number of our staff aren't eligible quite yet, just given, I know I'm not. So I'll just base it on my perception. I've been trying to get my mom an appointment, but so I would say if anybody, it's maybe just a handful would be my guess if I had to guess.
Here, and another interesting question we could probably talk a lot about, but what's your quick perception in terms of how collaboration has been affected, you know, with the remote work?
Good question. I mean, from some perspectives, it's been great in that we've had committee meetings that have had more people at them than ever before because people aren't traveling. Our board meetings have had good participation. I'd say on the local project side, our staff have been really resilient and thinking about how to do things, you know, safely, differently, in new and engaging different ways. But I have a feeling that people, as the weather starts to warm up, that might taper off. A combination of pandemic fatigue plus Zoom fatigue and nice weather. We'll see. I don't know, Michelle, did you want to weigh in? I know that you and your team have been, you and the outreach team have been thinking about this.
Yeah, I'll add that when it comes to public engagement, we definitely had to pivot some of our priorities. So we have an Engagement HQ page, and I presented on this last year after the FLIP program. I talked a little bit about how we utilized Engagement HQ to work with students during our Future Leaders in Planning program last year. Typically that program is held in person, but we were completely virtual last year. And so we've been creative about ways to be more engaged with people, especially some of our partner agencies. Most recently, the outreach team did a presentation for DePaul University students. Typically that's done in person, but that was done virtually this year via Zoom. So I think as we think about ways to be more engaged with our partners, think about ways to engage in the public. We are being creative about hybrid programs, whether it be some components in person, some of it's virtual, but I will say this past year has definitely allowed us to think about engagement in different ways. But we're still getting a lot of great feedback. We've done a lot of talks. CMAP Talks, as Aaron just mentioned, was another way we've been able to engage with the public. So we are still getting good feedback, but it's just a little different.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, and to that end too, if there are committee members that are doing things or you've seen something that was particularly effective, we would love to hear from you as well. So, you know, shoot us a note or share here, whatever makes sense. So that wraps it up for my. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think it's a I think one of the positives, if there is one, from the COVID approach, so to speak, is utilizing, some different ways of communication, and the fact that many situations have seen better participation at meetings because of the lack of travel. I think for the long term, I think CMAP needs to keep in mind that the Zoom approach and some of these other things should not be discarded as we move forward, just because we can come together doesn't mean that there may not be some benefits in many situations to continuing to have Zoom connections to basically reach out to more people at a given moment and reach more people who basically don't have the ability or flexibility on the travel situation.
All great points too. And I'll just note a good example of that is Heather and Garland have been joining the board and the policy committee meetings, even though they have moved to Iowa, and continue to, bring up important issues related to sidewalks being cleared during snow season. So it really offers some great opportunities. It's just making sure that people are able to take advantage of it in a meaningful way. I think is one of the things that we want to keep our eye on. But I anticipate fully when we get back to the office that Zoom and online meeting options, or at least for the committees that we're able to and aren't governed by some, higher state level legislation, if we're able to, I think that that's one of the things that we'd like to, I've been thinking about continuing to deploy here at CMAP. So that's it for me. I'm happy again. Thanks for asking questions. It's always more engaging when I get to have more of a conversation than yak at everybody.
Thank you, Erin. If there are any follow-up questions, I'm sure Erin's always available via email, but we do have a packed schedule today. So we will get through our presentations. And if there are any questions or comments towards the end of the meeting, we do have a discussion period in which we can talk a little bit more about today's presentations. Today's presentations are actually focused on transportation projects that the agency is currently undertaking. And so we did take into account the feedback that was given in our last meeting, in which our members talked about wanting to hear more about the work CMAP is doing within mobility recovery. And so we'll actually start off today with Stephanie Levine, who will speak about CMAP's mobility recovery work.
Thanks, Michelle. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stephanie Levine. I'm an analyst on the policy team. And today, like Michelle just mentioned, I'm going to give an overview of a recent initiative we've kicked off to understand the impacts of the COVID crisis on our mobility systems. Through this work, we're really looking to identify policy and program solutions that can help make our transportation system adaptable to new travel patterns and really support an equitable economic recovery. So we go next slide. Our transportation system is really the backbone of our region, and it does a lot more than just allow for daily commutes. It keeps our supply chain running, and it can also be an economic ladder of opportunity where it connects people to good jobs. So go to the next slide. We also know that our region's economy is very interconnected. So before the stay-at-home order, most workers in the Chicago region commuted across county boundaries, but the rate is especially high in the collar counties. So within the city of Chicago, 36% of residents tend to reverse commute either into suburban Cook County or into the collar counties, but more than 2/3 of residents in Will, McHenry, Kane, and Kendall counties cross county boundaries to go to work. So this was before the pandemic. Last summer, the region's 7 county board chairs came together to really start thinking about what a recovery process looks like for the whole region, not just within our own little sub areas. And with the understanding that our transportation challenges must be addressed at the regional scale, they've asked CMAP to coordinate these efforts on the transportation side. Next slide. Thanks. We know that the pandemic has had a significant impact on our region's roadway system. Here at CMAP, we've been actively monitoring and reporting on the travel trends across the region since last March. We know that passenger vehicle trips, which are shown here in blue, were down more than 40% last April, but as of this past fall had recovered to almost March 2020 levels. On the other hand, truck traffic recovered much more quickly, returning to expected and then higher levels than the previous year by May. These trends hint at a concern we all have, which is that there may be a significant increase in congestion during the recovery period and then after. And in this project, thinking about mobility recovery, we're going to look at solutions to address possible increases to congestion and also increases in trips with one person in the car, single occupancy vehicle trips. We also know that the pandemic has not improved the safety of our roads. And I know Vicki is on the agenda and we'll talk a lot about this in a little bit. By the end of 2020, the state of Illinois had 100 more fatalities than in 2019, over 1,000 in total. And here on this slide, we have a graph that shows just the city of Chicago. Go to the next slide. I know I'm rushing through these, but if anyone has questions about these are all on our website, and we've been sort of reporting and adding onto these graphs sort of as we go through this work from home period. So the sustainability of the transit system is central to all of this recovery work, both from a mobility perspective and also from an economic perspective. While we've seen a rebound in passenger vehicle trips like we saw on that first slide, transit ridership is still about 75% of what it was last year. And we know our transit partners are working just so hard day to day with the challenges of operating transit during a pandemic. And here at CMAP with this research, we're hoping to identify viable funding solutions and other mobility solutions that will help us ensure transit service levels across the board for all three of our transit agencies. So with all of these data points in mind, we know we can't assume that trends and patterns are going to go back to where they were in 2019. But we also want to acknowledge that even before the COVID crisis, the region faced a significant challenge to fully funding our transportation system and also ensuring equitable access for all of the residents in the region. But the pandemic has put many of these issues under a microscope, and through this project, we really want to understand better the impacts of the crisis and put forward an actionable plan that's going to help us stay on track towards meeting the goals that we set in ON-TO 2050, our region's long-range comprehensive plan. The project will look specifically at ways to mitigate a likely rebound in congestion, how we can sustain our transit system beyond the recovery phase, and also looking at the overall resiliency of the region's multimodal system and how we can address all of these problems through an equity lens. So here we have the primary steps of the research we've kicked off. We're going to do a scan of national and international mobility systems to create sort of a policy literature review of solutions that might make sense in Chicago in a post-COVID world. Then we're going to characterize COVID-related changes in employment, real estate markets, and travel preferences. This step is really important because right now there's so much we don't know about land use and behavioral changes that have occurred since the pandemic. So this will inform a lot of the steps that come afterwards. We're going to then do some in-house modeling, some travel demand modeling at CMAP of how some of the trends we're seeing in our scans and previous steps are going to impact travel in the short to medium term. And then we're going to use those results to sort of create a universe of travel demand management strategies, so different policy solutions that we could employ to sort of adapt to these new travel trends. So when we make this universe list of policy solutions, we'll then tailor them to all of the different markets and different travel patterns across the region. The work is really intended to be a step-by-step iterative process, and we hope that the deliverables we'll develop along the way are going to be helpful to our partners, the transportation implementers and decision makers, especially as conditions change over the coming months because things are just changing and evolving so quickly. Go on to the next slide, thanks. This project will ultimately culminate in a strategic action plan. We're expecting this in the fall of 2022, which will have recommendations that are focused in the short to medium term, all working towards the goals that we already have set for our long range plan. You can see here in the bottom row, we have a steering committee for the project. This is really the backbone of a lot of these efforts and will provide our team ongoing feedback to make sure we're really keyed into other recovery efforts as they develop. Go on to the next slide. So our steering committee has representation from our MPO policy committee. We also have members from civic and community groups and leaders from the business community as well. We had our first steering committee meeting about 2 weeks ago, and we got some really good feedback from the group on our initial methodologies and approaches for some of this research we'll be undertaking. And then next slide. To help us complete this pretty ambitious project, we've also contracted with AECOM Technical Services as a consultant to assist us. They have partnered with Transmart EJM and the Center for Neighborhood Technology, and the AECOM team has tons of national experience working on different travel demand strategies in regions and urban areas all across the country, but especially over the last year as it relates to COVID changes on transportation systems. So they'll really bring in some additional technical capacity to the CMAP team. And then Transmart EJM is going to contribute to the policy and strategy development, and CNT as our partner will bring in their Transportation Equity Network, or the TEN network. You might be familiar with them. It's a newly formed group it's a coalition of community groups, equitable transportation advocates, and civic organizations, and they're working to embed racial equity and mobility justice into transportation investments. So the contributions of the TEN network is really a small part of other larger efforts at CMAP that we're undertaking to bring voices to the table that have not historically been included in transportation planning. So I have some discussion questions for the group today. I'm also happy to answer any questions you might have about the different steps of this project. But I thought we could just start off. I'm really curious, what are your biggest concerns for sort of the regional transportation system, both during the recovery period and beyond? And I know if you're like me, it's sort of hard to think about the beyond part, but just in the last few weeks, it's becoming a little bit easier. So just curious on your thoughts on that. And then if we have some time, we're also curious how your organization or you, if you're just an individual, may be able to support the success of this project. And what we mean by that is, who should we be talking, maybe helping us figure out who we need to bring into the project, who we should be talking to, other recovery efforts that are happening in the region, and other things we should be aware of.
Well, for me, one of them is just sustainability, so I live in Woodstock, and I know we've had a reduction in Metro. I'm assuming that's probably system-wide, but obviously it's demand driven. And on the other hand, these communities that are to some extent still reliant, I think, on that rail connection that we've got for the downtown development. And there's a pretty good sized, development still to be done here in Woodstock. You wonder where that's at. I think back 10 to 15 years ago, and I think Metro had plans at the time to extend service further northwest. There's a yard in Harvard and Crystal, and then one in Crystal Lake. So we stood to have more options in Woodstock because the yard would be moved northwest of town. And that didn't happen. And so now obviously the drawback has been even more with the pandemic. So I think just again, sustainability, I'm, probably aware too of like the PACE system and those services that even out here are critical for, segments of the community. So a couple of things I'm thinking.
Absolutely. And all of our transit partners are on our steering committee for this project. And, Metra in particular has been running a reduced schedule just because of lower demand, but they're doing a lot of thinking at Metra about how to adapt to new travel patterns that are really not focused on those peak hours into and out of downtown, and thinking about transitioning from what we consider them to be a commuter rail to what they're calling more of a regional rail system, and what that means when people's travel patterns are just more fluid and not really centered around those daily commutes, or not a five day a week daily commute. So I think they're really looking at those schedules and trying to figure out how they can really serve those markets, especially the markets out where you are, Kevin.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to say, I think trust is a big issue. I think getting people to be confident and comfortable to use the system is important. I mean, it's critical, quite frankly. I mean, you go to parking lots and they're empty. Those that were always packed. There's no cars there. People, I mean, at least most of the influx. Now, that goes along with the fact that changing patterns of usage that are probably going to emerge from post-COVID. I think we're going to see a different approach by many people who realize that they can work from home or not need to have their employees commute. So I think we're going to see
Testing.
very, very significant evolution in terms of change in what those commuter patterns are in terms of numbers. And that ties into the sustainability, because then the question is, number one, what is that usage is going to be post-COVID? And number two, then you could tie into the sustainability, because sustainability is going to be at a different level than what it was before. And I think those issues are all sort of are tied together. And I don't think we have the answers yet, obviously. But I think those are some of the questions that we're going to have to deal with.
One other thing too, on the recreational side, so more, usage of public open space and sites. And I think along with that, probably more investment in recreational vehicles, including bicycles. So you look at that chart, and the fatalities that has increased as well. So again, I think just the opportunities as we're thinking long-term for our communities, bicycle friendly, what can be done in the investments that are going to take place.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And Daniel's coming up next, and I think he's going to be talking quite a bit about some of those responses we've seen at the local level and how communities are trying to encourage more active modes. We know there's just been such a huge increase in interest in walking and biking and doing those things outdoors that we can do safely over the last year. And that will be part of what we're looking at in this project as well. We have so many of our transportation partners and municipalities that run, bike share and other sort of active mode and ride share options. And everyone's working in their own silos, and we don't really have a forum where we can talk about more integration of, for example, ride sharing or other active modes with regional transit and other, county level initiatives. And so we're really trying to think across the whole spectrum of all of our transportation options within the region and try to break down some of those silos that naturally happen when you're just working on one program at a time or at one place.
Have we gotten any feedback from like the Association of Commerce and Industry and so forth in the metro area as to their projections on a post-COVID reality?
For about sort of commute patterns and
Right. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of speculation. I've been doing the webinar rounds, and the number of times I've heard a lot of folks say if I had a crystal ball, I could too many times to count. But I think that's what we're really the gap we're trying to fill here is we have lots of different data sets we've used in isolated situations when it comes to land use trends and travel patterns, and we're trying to really bring them all together and take all the information we have to answer those questions. But if there aren't any other comments, I think that was actually a great transition because Daniel is up next and going to be talking about some of those recent initiatives about walking and biking.
Thank you, Stephanie. Again, always appreciate having an update on these projects. But if there are any questions for Stephanie, feel free to follow up by email. We can always just, Stephanie, if you don't mind, maybe adding your email to the chat if there are follow-up questions. But we'll move on to our next presentation, which will be by Daniel Como. He'll be talking about biking and walk pattern changes during COVID.
Thanks, Michelle, and thanks, Stephanie. I apologize, there's someone honking outside if you hear some loud beeping. So I'm going to talk today about what we've seen in terms of changes in biking and walking patterns during COVID-19, but especially focusing on what local governments, both here in the region and elsewhere, have done in response to those changes, and thinking about the sorts of questions that we will need to be asking and trying to get your input on as we continue to respond to these changes moving forward and potentially make some of the temporary things that we've done into more permanent solutions. So if you could flip to the next slide, please. So like Stephanie was showing, COVID-19 has impacted travel of all kinds. You've probably changed the way that you're getting around or not getting around. And one mode in particular or one set of modes in particular that's seen a great deal of change is biking and walking, which have become relatively more important as people try to avoid shared indoor spaces. So whether that's a bus or some sort of shared vehicle, these outdoor options have become relatively more attractive and thus relatively more important. Firm data on this can be somewhat hard to come by, but we have certainly seen reports of bike shops running out of bikes. The region's bike share systems like Divvy have seen record ridership. And we've also seen the ways in which the existing infrastructure just isn't set up to deal with the realities of a pandemic. And so, sidewalks are a good example of this. We were all told, stay 6 feet apart, but sidewalks are often not 6 feet wide. And certainly they're not 12 feet wide if you have, lots of people on a crowded space. And so if you flip to the next slide, you'll see that, here in the region and elsewhere, we've made some changes. You've probably seen some of these yourself. One thing that was very popular and I think will continue to be popular is pedestrianizing streets. So that's, restricting their use to where, maybe before it was for cars, but now it's open to bicyclists and walkers. We've also seen the region's transit agencies like Metra make accommodations for increased interest in biking. And so on the bottom right, there's a photo of what's now a bike car on the MD North Line on Metra, which is a dedicated car that runs on several trips a day that has extra space for bike racks, more than you could fit on a normal Metro train. But Metra's also changed their policies so that you can now bring bikes onto trains at all times. This is in response to they have fewer passengers, they can fit more bikes, and they've made this change to accommodate the interest in biking. Of course, when you get your bike to a place, you often need to also be able to park it. And so another good example of these changes is municipalities thinking creatively about installing additional bike racks and thinking about where to place them. So on the top left, that's a photo of a bike rack in Highland Park. And they installed this not on the sidewalk where it might actually force pedestrians to come close together, but just off the sidewalk on a previously unused piece of the curb space. And then finally, another thing that's happened here in the region is we've seen new bike lanes installed using quick build infrastructure, and I'll have a photo of that in a couple of slides. So if you can flip to the next slide, please. So, we are not the only place in the world that is dealing with the impacts of biking and walking from the pandemic. And so there are some really good examples that we have been watching and think are good for our region to learn from. We've definitely seen much more ambitious expansions of bike lane networks, especially in the early days of the pandemic. Cities like Boston or Milan or Bogota were putting out major new bike lanes just with cones, so you could install that in a matter of days. And so that's a picture that's on the top left. But we've also seen people making more permanent changes. And I think this is where this work is going to feed into the mobility recovery project that Stephanie was discussing. One good example of this is European cities and countries that are looking at speed limits as a way to make the environment on the roadway safer and more comfortable for bicyclists and pedestrians, and ultimately also for drivers. But so Madrid, Spain lowered its speed limits to 30 kilometers an hour. That's about 18 miles an hour. And that, as I'm sure Vicky will talk about, those sorts of speed limit changes can actually really reduce the risk of serious injuries or fatalities. And we've also seen here in the US places taking some of these street closures that they have done as a temporary measure and making them permanent. And so Seattle announced that, the streets that they had closed are made, more pedestrian accessible. That will remain even after the pandemic restrictions are lifted. And so these are the sorts of changes that, are occurring, that, we are watching, and that we think will, inform what the Chicago region is doing moving forward. If you can flip to the next slide, I wanted to highlight one thing is that these changes don't have to be made in isolation, and they're often more powerful if you combine them. And so on the left, it's a rendering, but the changes have since been made, but I thought the rendering was helpful because it explains what everything is. This is a bike lane project on Chicago's Northwest Side in Logan Square. And this is an example of the quick build infrastructure that I talked about. The curb barriers that the Chicago Department of Transportation installed were cheaper and quicker to install than a traditional concrete barrier, but they still provide some protection for the cyclists and enforce the separation between the bicyclist and the cars in the roadway. But this set of changes was combined with other changes like a pedestrian bump out, which shortens the distance that pedestrians have to cross. So it makes it more comfortable and safer for pedestrians. And it also, notes that there's the 20-mile-per-hour speed limit sign, additional crosswalks. All these sorts of things together can make it more, it both responds to the increased demand for cycling and walking, and also then makes it even more likely that more people will take it up. Because these are modes that, you are in, as a pedestrian or a cyclist, if you are in a dangerous situation in conflict with cars, you might just choose not to make that trip in that way. But if you have a safer option, it becomes more attractive. And certainly this has been true during COVID, but we think it will also be an important consideration as restrictions are lifted. On the right, this is maybe less connected to pedestrians, but I think it's been a really common example throughout the region, and something that again will be important moving forward. We've seen a large number of local governments around the region close streets or partially closed streets to accommodate increased pedestrian space and increased outdoor dining space. And those have been, I think, very popular projects, but they also are a good example of this makes the whole streetscape and urban space more welcoming and accommodating for lots of different users, and not just one mode or the other. If you flip to the next slide, we'd written a piece about this exact topic in December before the latest round of winter storms. And something we said then, which is certainly true now, is that snow management is just as important for bicyclists and pedestrians as it is for cars. And so, many of you probably experienced this yourself. Whenever we think about making sure that our roadways can accommodate, or our urban environment can accommodate the demand of bicyclists and pedestrians, preparing for winters is really crucial. I have some photos on the right, but they're from around the region, and they show the important role in particular that sidewalks play. And so whether you're grocery shopping in Bedford Park, or pushing your stroller in Hyde Park, or getting to the metro station in Berwyn, the sidewalk is a really important connection, both as a mode in itself and also as a connection to other modes. The same thing is true of bike lanes in the region. Many of them were cleared of snow, but many of them were not. I was biking around this weekend and still found bike lanes that had giant piles of ice blocking the way. And so as we look both to the next couple of months, which may have some snow, fingers crossed, nothing of the scale we just had, and certainly as we look to future winters, snow management and winter preparedness in general are, they're critical for our whole transportation network, but they're especially important for, bicyclists and pedestrians and people in wheelchairs, many of whom will have the ability to cross over a snowbank or, roll along in a light amount of snow, but many of whom won't. And so, we view this as an important, aspect of the transportation system for people to be thinking about. And also it's an opportunity for local governments to collaborate potentially by identifying, key networks of sidewalks and bike lanes, and maybe thinking about regional collaboration to make sure that at least those key routes are clear. So if you flip to the last substantial slide, what do we do now? I think that there's a few different areas of conversation, and this is where I think your input is very helpful. We need to get input from the public, both from you and other groups, on which of the steps that have already been taken, which of them have worked, which of them haven't. Are there changes in demand that we haven't noticed? And so we need to study the levels of demand, how it responds as pandemic restrictions are lifted. We need to understand how these changes and our responses to them affect different users, different types of users, and are there any of the policies having unintended consequences? And then if and when we decide to make some of these changes more permanent, how are we going to fund them? Comparatively, these are not very expensive projects, but they are not free. And so, across the country, we've seen, sometimes these are funded through existing local budgets or through county or state grant or federal grant programs, or even private philanthropy. And so that's, all of these questions are the ones that we are thinking about, that we think local governments are going to have to think about. But if we answer them and continue to implement policies, these are the sorts of things that can move us more toward the goals of ONCHU 2050. So with that, would love any questions or any of your own experiences on, in particular, the changes in biking and walking that you've seen for yourself or your community during the past 12 months. And if not, I know we have a packed schedule, so
Thank you, Daniel.
my email's on the next slide, and thank y'all for your time.
All right, thank you, Daniel. Again, feel free to reach out to Daniel via email. Also, Dustin and I will be happy to take comments and send them over to today's presenters as well. But we'll move on to our next item, which will be a presentation by Vicki Jacobson on CMAP's Regional Traffic Safety Agenda.
Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Jacobson. Feel free to call me Vicki. I joined CMAP in the fall of last year with the specific task of bringing this regional travel safety action agenda forward. This agenda was born out of a request from our transportation committee, really, in the late 2019. So before 2020 happened, which is important because this travel safety agenda is a reaction to long-term traffic safety concerns in our region. When the idea was born, no one knew what 2020 was going to bring. So when I saw the agenda today, I thought it's not only was I excited to hear these presentations, but it's very interesting to now frame traffic safety based on what has happened in the last year. I mean, it's profound. It's had a profound effect on the meaning of the word safety as we travel, and it's also given us an opportunity to learn, as Daniel pointed out, as we pilot projects and test out new ways to make our roads safer for more users. It's been somewhat of an opportunity for us in that regard to try some new things that wouldn't have maybe happened otherwise. So please advance to the next slide here, and I'll explain a little bit about what this action agenda is about. So as I mentioned, this is a program that is reacting to long-term trends in our region and in fact nationally. If you can dig beyond the headlines of COVID, which are very important, but you might have also noticed a lot of headlines about the increasing number of traffic fatalities on our roadways. Certainly those were exacerbated actually during the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but even with a decline in the vehicle miles traveled, we saw a spike in traffic fatalities. So there are some concerning trends going on in our roadways. But we've also been experiencing this rise in traffic fatalities since about 2014. CMAP as an MPO is federally mandated to set highway safety performance targets. We do that currently in close coordination with the Illinois Department of Transportation. So there's some degree of accountability for us as we set those targets, and we have to date not met any of them. We have been lining up our targets with IDOT, and we're not making the targets. In fact, as I mentioned, our trends are going in the opposite direction. There is an increasing concern about improving traffic safety on local roads in our region. So the Illinois Department of Transportation, it has jurisdiction over a large number of our major roads, including our entire highway system. But there are increasing number of crashes on local and arterial roads that are owned by counties and local municipalities. So there might be an opportunity for us to provide some guidance there on safety. As I mentioned, safety is an evolving topic right now as we not only consider the impacts of COVID-19 on mobility, but there's an equity lens to our work that I'm going to talk about a little bit more. And there's climate concerns to our work. So we'll factor those into the safety agenda. And there is a growing interest in active transportation, as Daniel pointed to. And this was occurring pre-pandemic and has certainly been kind of exploded since the pandemic. Next slide, please. So just quickly go over some of the data points that spurred this agenda into action. The blue line are the raw numbers of annual fatalities in the CMAP region. And then the orange line is the 5-year average, which is a typical trend line that you see with traffic safety because it levels out some of the randomness that just generally occurs within a crash. So you can see that starting in about 2014, those numbers and that trend line have started to tick upwards after decades of decline. So since the 70s and 80s, when seatbelt laws became the very common, we saw crashes, we saw roadway fatalities drop significantly over the course of many decades. And only in 2014 did they start to tick upwards again. Next slide, please. Another really concerning trend is that bicyclists and pedestrians represent a growing number of fatalities and serious injuries in our region. So again, the blue numbers are the raw numbers for our region. The orange line is the 5-year average for non-motorized fatalities and serious injuries. And that that orange trend line has started to tick upwards as well since about 2014. Next slide, please. And then finally, this graph kind of gets to the point about the local road system. So the orange line on this graph are the IDOT system roads. So these are the highways and the state routes that are under the Illinois Department of Transportation jurisdiction. And then the blue line represents local and county roads. So you can see that the total number of crashes happening in our region are happening, a majority of, or more of them are happening on local road system. And indeed, the total number of injuries and serious injuries are also happening on more of them are happening on our local road system. The only place where that flips is the fatalities, and that's of course because the IDOT system includes the highway system, and there are always more fatalities at higher speeds and crashes that occur at higher speeds, which is why that's the one number where the state system sees more fatalities. Next slide, please. So as we try to address safety in this agenda, it's important to frame our work under the ONTO 2050 goals. There are a lot of aspects and dimensions to traffic safety. I'll go through those in a few minutes, but it's important that as we solve for it, that we include this idea of inclusive growth and making our transportation system work better for everyone. And that includes all modes of travel, and knowing that bicyclists and pedestrians are particularly vulnerable to traffic safety issues because they're not protected by a vehicle shell. They're kind of a priority topic right now, especially with the data that we're seeing. Our plan also calls for designs of roadways that specifically reduce speeding. Speed is a major issue that I'll talk about in a little bit as well. And indeed, our plan it has a call to eliminate all traffic deaths by 2050. That's the safe systems kind of idea, or Vision Zero idea, that's included in our plan, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Next slide, please. So this resilience piece also factors into the safety work. Not only does this refer to supporting climate-friendly modes like walking, bicycling, and accessing transit, it also means that as we solve for safety, we'll look for opportunities to incorporate green infrastructure. And then I think, there's kind of a new meaning of resilience as well. As I mentioned, we saw a drop in vehicle miles traveled during 2020, which surprisingly resulted in an increased number of fatalities. And we suspect the idea, and the data sort of points to the idea, that there was an increase in speed. So an aggressive speeding, which is speeding over at least 15 miles per hour over the speed limit. So we have a transportation system that supported very unsafe behaviors when travel demand changed. So we'll look for opportunities to address the resilience of our transportation system to meet demands and stay safe at the same time. Next slide, please. And then finally, prioritized investment. That's the third principle of our On to 2050 plan. We'll look for ways to advance safety in all of our project selection processes, and we'll also try to help local municipalities and counties prioritize projects that promote traffic safety. Next slide. So the mission of this regional traffic safety action agenda is to address these long-term regional traffic safety trends in a comprehensive way, in an equitable way, in a way that's data-driven, and in collaboration with the many people doing excellent work on traffic safety in our region. We're going to center the work around CMAP's core values, our implementation levers, which have to do with convening and developing policies and collaborating, and the On to 2050 guiding principles that I just mentioned. As I mentioned, there's a lot of excellent work being done. Illinois Department of Transportation is a close partner in this effort, as are many of the departments of transportation at the county levels in the region. So we're going to work to support those efforts and not reinvent the wheel when we don't have to. And then we're also hoping that an outcome of this action agenda is to develop a long-term regional traffic safety coalition and really develop a stronger culture of safety when it comes to mobility in our region. Next slide, please. So traffic safety, you may have encountered these before. It's typically been, compartmentalized into, the E's of traffic safety, which have been engineering, the design of our roadways, education, which is everything from awareness campaigns to driver's ed curricula. Emergency services is the ability for the public to respond to crashes and deliver health services quickly to prevent fatalities or injuries from getting worse, and also not create more crashes on the roadway as they access a crash location, for example. Enforcement is another big piece of traffic safety, and it's one that needs to be discussed today, especially in light of a lot of the equity issues and concerns that are going on around enforcement, and also a recently passed state bill, which might change enforcement and how enforcement is done in the future. And again, we want equity to be centered in this work, and so equity traditionally has not been included in the E's of traffic safety, but there is a growing movement nationally to make that one of the most important E's, as we not only address the enforcement piece, but also the equitable distribution of safety infrastructure. Next slide, please. There are 4 components of this action agenda. The first is a traffic safety resource group that we formed. We had our first meeting at the end of January. It includes regional partners from all the different E's that I just went through. It's a short-term mission-driven group that will meet for probably 18 months or 2 years, depending on what we get planned and the work that we want to accomplish. The resource group will help develop the framework, the timeline, the research program that we undertake, and also the implementation tools that we provide to our regional partners on safety. Next slide, please. The second piece of the action agenda is the data research and best practices. So we are currently kind of exhaustively looking for new forms of data to understand safety. You know, we get a certain amount of data from the Illinois Department of Transportation, but that doesn't always give us a very timely way of understanding the impact of traffic safety programs. So we are exploring opportunities to include new metrics that might be from connected devices and vehicles or cell phones, or how can we understand the many dimensions of traffic safety better to address it and measure the performance of our program. We want to develop a program that can predict outcomes as well as react to outcomes. So traditionally, traffic safety is, you know, you identify intersections with the highest crash rates and then you go fix that intersection. But there are an increasingly number, and it's not quite artificial intelligence, but it's these programs that analyze your geometry on your roadway and try to tell you where crashes are likely to occur based on operating speeds and the design of the roadway. So there's some really interesting opportunities in that technology. And we'll of course include all the best practice and expertise of our resource group and other MPOs in the country. Next slide. And then we're also going to get our hands dirty while we develop the implementation part of this safety action agenda. We're going to do some projects, and we just kicked off the Flossmoor Local Road Safety Plan, where we not only hope to help Flossmoor address some of their traffic safety concerns and support access to their schools and their train station and other and intersections that are problematic, but we also hope to learn from that project, so we can learn what local municipalities need in terms of data and resources to address local safety issues. We also just recently closed a call for local technical assistance projects with the new category of safety planning. So we're now we have a pot of money that's specifically there to address safety planning issues, and we're excited to test out some of those programs. We have other pilot projects that we hope to do in the future. We also hope to bring the resources that we learn from these projects to the region, so that everyone can learn while we do. And then we will eventually incorporate these lessons learned into our project selection processes. So of the transportation funding that CMAP puts out, will make safety a real priority there. And lastly, so possible deliverables. These are kind of our brainstorm list of things that could evolve from the safety action agenda. What could this look like? So we can imagine that we have heard that there is a need for local and county governments to get safety data readily, quickly. And right now it's available at the state level. So if we have the opportunity to kind of analyze it and provide it to local governments in a way that's really useful, that's something that we're looking into. We are exploring the idea of a kind of Vision Zero sign-on for the region. That's the systemic safety approach, which is a new approach that the FHWA and the National Safety Council and other folks are kind of adopting as a way to think about traffic safety more systemically. We may be providing bicycle and pedestrian safety design guidance, for example. That's an issue. Bicycle and pedestrian safety is a primary concern, as I mentioned. And if local and county governments could benefit from regionally relevant guidance, then we'll look into providing that. We want to connect people with education and awareness programs as much as possible. There was a real, behavior is a huge piece of traffic safety, and to the extent that we can connect local governments with programs and resources associated with that at the state level or beyond, this program will try to do that. And we'll also put forward at some point, there's a desire to hear about all the options there are from an enforcement standpoint. Enforcement is kind of under the lens right now in the news, and there are a lot of questions being asked about what forms of enforcement are the most effective, are the most equitable, and the most affordable, quite frankly. A lot of local municipalities have expressed a concern about how expensive it is if you want to do regular enforcement on, roadways that are big and long and where people drive fast. So how can we help communities kind of prioritize their enforcement practices? And then there's the policy pieces. So there are some policies at the state level, whether it's a complete streets is strengthening the state's complete streets policies. There's a school-based curriculum policy that was recently passed that really that's designed to teach kids safe skills when it comes to walking and bicycling in the schools, and it hasn't gotten a lot of traction. So that's maybe another area where we could strengthen the policy. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I mentioned we had our first resource group meeting in January. It was very, how would I say? It was very passionate. I mean, there's a real sense of urgency about the importance of this work right now. And everyone is, there are a lot of folks that are really excited to dig in and collaborate on this topic in a new way. Traffic safety is kind of a new area for an MPO. I mean, there are a few folks out there in the states that are doing some really great work, but it's only since MAP 21, the Federal Transportation Authorization in 2014, where MPOs had to start setting targets that really put safety as something that MPOs need to be accountable for. So it's kind of, we're seeing the results of that, and MPOs are getting increasingly concerned about traffic safety, particularly as our national numbers get worse. People have asked us to take on some of the more difficult issues that can be very tricky to navigate at a local level politically. So there may be a role for CMAP in some of those topics. Certainly to assemble knowledge, connect people with resources, analyze and share relevant data, as I mentioned, and yes, funding. Help prepare local municipalities to apply for the many funding sources around traffic safety. Next slide. Yeah, and the other thing that we got out of our resource group in January was consensus that the topics to focus on right now are speed management. Speed is our second pandemic right now, and bicycle and pedestrian safety. So, and of course they overlap and have a lot of, they each relate to each other quite closely. So we're going to figure out the tools that will help local municipalities address each of those topics. And also people were saying, you're a planning agency, but behavior is important, and it's an important thing to keep out in the public realm. So to the extent that CMAP has a voice, we intend to use it to promote better travel behavior and safe traveling behavior and help create this culture of safety in the region. And yeah, so we're working internally on these topics now. We're doing a lot of outreach. We're starting to kind of unpack these focus areas of bicycle and pedestrian safety and identify the metrics that will allow us to measure progress going forward, and educating ourselves on what a safe systems or Vision Zero kind of regional charter might look like. So I think that is the end, but I'm happy to take any questions. I'm happy to hear about any local traffic safety concerns or points that are happening for you all in your communities.
Thank you, Vicki. Do we have any questions for Vicki? I actually do have a quick follow-up, Vicki. In thinking about, developing this traffic safety agenda. I'm curious to know if there's feedback you're hoping to receive from committee members. What will be useful at this time as you're developing this agenda? Maybe we can even send comments in via email, but curious to know what will be helpful at this time.
Well, I mean, we certainly want to hear from any groups that are doing similar work. We have heard a couple times that there are some county level groups that are meeting to talk about safety, and it might be quite informal, but there are people that are kind of starting to collaborate on this topic. We're looking for feedback on key issues, you know, and who needs what resources. So is it, you know, what do counties need versus what do local governments need? What can we be saying to the general public on the topic of safety that would help create that culture of safety that we're hoping to see? And again, particularly on the bicycle and pedestrian topic and speed management will they have a lot of gravity right now.
Thank you, Vicki. And that's all very helpful. Any thoughts on that before we move on to our final presentation? Okay. Vicki's email is also on the final slide here. Feel free to send her any emails about what we discussed today, or even if you have any questions on what was covered. Thank you again, Vicki.
Thank you.
All right. We'll move on to our final presentation today, which will be by Jen Maddox. She's going to be talking about the Northern Lakeshore Trail Connectivity Plan.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to share with you today. My name is Jen Maddox. I'm an associate planner here at CMAP. I work over with Dustin in local planning, and I served as the project manager for this recently completed plan, which we lovingly call the Northern Lakeshore Trail Connectivity Plan. I'm going to drop a link to the plan in the chat right now. There's quite a few maps, so I didn't include them in my presentation because they would be very small. Next slide, please. So this project was completed under CMAP's Local Technical Assistance, or LTA program. We wrapped it up last fall, and I'm excited to tell you a little bit later about some of the progress we already made. But our partners included 5 municipalities, and those were Beach Park, North Chicago, Waukegan, Winthrop Harbor, and Zion. We also partnered with the Illinois Department of Natural Resources. So this was a relatively big project for CMAP, and we had the help of a great team of consultants. And if you can see the map a little bit, I'm just going to orient you to the study area. It's a little small, but again, you could take a look in the document. We're bounded by the Wisconsin state line on the north, Green Bay Road on the west, the municipal boundary of North Chicago on the south, and obviously the lakefront on the east, which includes Illinois Beach State Park. Next slide. So why these 5 communities? How did we get here? How did we come up with this plan idea? Well, each of these communities had previously worked on a plan with CMAP's LTA program on various planning efforts, and all of them kind of recommended further planning specifically around bicycle and pedestrian connections. With IDNR having the state park in the area, they were interested in collaborating, and so they came into the mix too and helped us with funding some of this project as well. Next slide. The vision and the purpose was pretty simple. We wanted to improve walking and biking conditions within each community and identify existing and potential connecting routes among the communities and to the lakefront. Next slide. So relative to other LTA plans, this was quite an undertaking. The idea was to connect all the municipalities to one another, but also to regional trails, all the forest preserves, community parks, and of course the state park, which attracts many tourists every year. Next slide. So the goals of this plan are very similar to many of the bicycle and pedestrian plans that we've completed under the LTA program. First, we want to create routes that provide a strong sense of security for all users. We want this plan to provide healthy and affordable mobility options. This one was really important. For this one, we want to connect residents to natural areas and key destinations. And finally, we want to promote a welcoming environment for all those visitors and potential businesses. Next slide. I just want to highlight the engagement piece of this plan because we really saw the full spectrum here, the way the timeline kind of worked out. You can go to the next slide. Back in the summer of 2019, we had great engagement events, high attendance. Folks could look closely at maps, ask questions, place stickers on maps where they, saw locations that they could, envision potential improvements. Just, trusted and effective engagement techniques. We also had kiosks set up that linked to the engagement website where folks could do the same thing kind of virtually. Next slide. But then, about this time last year, we were kind of cut off from that and unable to engage with the communities in the way that we really wanted to. And this happened right before the final community open house where we were going to, be presenting all the plan recommendations. So that posed a challenge. You can go to the next slide. So, it was a time of a lot of uncertainty. At the beginning of the pandemic, we weren't really sure what tools were available, but the team did a really good job and ramped up outreach efforts in as many ways as they could to reach as many people as possible. We held that last open house virtually. We printed posters of the plan, hung them around village halls and other places in the communities. We targeted some small groups in the community for virtual meetings. And of course, we increased efforts on all of our social media platforms. And we did get some of the feedback that we were hoping for. Next slide. In light of time, I'll just briefly go over some of the recommendations, but I do encourage you to skim through that plan to see them more in detail. Thank you. So the project recommendations resulted in a network of over 100 miles of improvements. And these are primarily focusing on the connections through the municipalities to the lakefront with a lot of east-west connections. While our study boundary on the west is Green Bay Road, the idea is to set these up to eventually connect to the Des Plaines River Trail on the west. Next slide. So like I mentioned, we created detailed maps with legends of project recommendations for each municipality as well as for IDNR. We provided cost estimates to assist in grant applications and really just kind of laid out the maps that will hopefully be useful for them just in information gathering and again to try to get funding for the projects. Next slide. So as part of a general kind of bike ped plan, it does explain different types of bike ped infrastructure and kind of gives indications on when to use each of them based on the conditions of the roadway, other factors like traffic. We also provided guidelines for train station and bus stop improvements, as well as wayfinding signage that kind of all the communities agreed on their own branding. So we're going to be kind of pursuing that in tandem with some Lake County wayfinding signage. So it was good to find a partnership there. And next slide. Beyond infrastructure components, we wanted to make sure to include strategies to get people really thinking about walking and cycling. The plan encourages our partners to implement policies like complete streets, snow clearing and traffic calming ordinances, some of the stuff that Victoria spoke to earlier. In addition, getting the villages and other partners to promote education programs, safe routes for kids, events even like open street days, bike parades, just get people's mindset that, there are all people out there walking and biking more so than ever. Next slide. So you will often hear planners say that, we never want a plan to just sit on a shelf. So throughout this planning process, we are always looking forward to implementation, keeping that in the back of our minds. Next slide. So in alignment with one of ON2 2050's core principles, prioritized investment, we really thought about how that might be implemented through this plan. So in this regard, the plan provides each community strategies to carefully target resources to maximize their benefits. We'd like to see each of them adopt these policies and resolutions that support the specific projects identified in the plan. We want them to be able to use those project descriptions, maps, and cost estimates in grant applications and hopefully lessen the burden of that process. And in a way to kind of prioritize projects in a relatively simple way, we came to consensus that everybody was just going to start with primary pathways along Sheridan Road and proceed west from the lakefront. Next slide. So I mentioned the plan was completed back in October, and as a result, we've already seen a lot of progress. Winthrop Harbor, Beach Park, and North Chicago have adopted complete streets policies. Beach Park has an application into ITEP to do all of their recommendations along Sheridan Road within their municipal limits. And their board also passed a resolution supporting the project and committing matching funds if they are awarded the ITEP grant. And as I understand, they're also planning to apply for CMAP and RTA funding programs. In addition, the Village of Zion is interested in leading a multi-jurisdictional project, which we're always a huge fan of. Again, that prioritized investment. And IDNR is actually set to construct one of the project recommendations. That's a connection on the state line of Wisconsin. So that should be done by the end of this summer. Next slide. Just a few quick highlights. The communities all received honorable mention for the 2019 Innovation Award from the Lake County Municipal League, which was pretty exciting. The hybrid public engagement, we got to see really early on in the pandemic, the challenges and the benefits of the different types of engagement and what works where and what doesn't. A lot of relationships were created and strengthened. We had so many partners on this project. And, I can tell that the communities are already sustaining those and working together about, how to get RFQs out, what kind of maintenance costs to expect. So that was really cool to see. And finally, just this early implementation, they hit the ground running and the momentum is still going. And I see that this plan is going to have some potential to get implemented fairly quickly. Next slide. And yeah, that's all I have. I don't have any questions, but I'm happy to answer any of your questions or take any comments.
Thank you, Jen. We do have about a minute or so left for any questions for Jen.
Looks cool. I'm excited to read through that PDF you shared with us too. Thank you.
Awesome.
It looks like
Yeah,
a lot
that's
of
good to
hard
hear.
work and coordination between all those communities had to be a challenge, but I think this is very exciting.
Yes, it was a challenge. We had a lot of turnover among staff and village administration among the communities, different departments in IDNR, but we really found a really good path to consensus. So it was a good process.
Thank you, Jen. And just to actually wrap us up, we had a couple of minutes that we set aside for discussion, but because we had such a fruitful discussion with Erin this at the very top end of the meeting, we are just going to move on to public comments. Do we have any comments from the public at this time?
They're out in cyberspace.
Seems to be so. All right. So then I'm just going to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So move.
All right. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Kevin.
Mhm.
All right. And before we head out, I did want to share a link in the chat. So as I mentioned, today's presentations covered transportation topics, but you can find a piece that was recently published in our weekly that talks about some of the work CMAP has done during the pandemic to track safety trends as well as transit ridership. So you can find that link in the chat now. But thank you, everyone. We will see you on June 8th for our next committee meeting.
See you
Thanks,
then.
everybody.
Thank you. And thank you to our presenters today.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Stay safe, everybody. Take care.